Section 24 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Cheryl Holmes, MD. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Pharmacology of the Coffee Drink, Part 2. Action of coffee on bacteria. The employment of coffee as an aid to sanitation has been but little considered. Coffee, when freshly roasted and ground, is deodorant, antiseptic, and germicidal, probably due to the empyromatic products developed during the process of roasting. An infusion of 0.5% inhibits the growth of many pathogenic organisms, and those of 10% kill anthrax bacteria in 3 hours, cholera spirilla in 4 hours, and many other bacteria, including those producing typhoid, in 2 to 6 days. The maintenance of a low rate of contraction of typhoid fever has often been attributed to drinking of coffee instead of water, the action of the coffee being partly due to the bactericidal effect of the caffeol and partly to the boiling of the water before infusion. The stimulating tendency of the caffeine to sustain and to tide over those of low vitalities is also evidenced. Use of coffee in medicine. Coffee has been employed in medicinal practice as a direct specific, as a preventative, and as an antidote. The United States Dispensatory summarizes the uses of caffeine and coffee as follows. Caffeine is a valuable remedy in practical medicine as a cerebral and cardiac stimulant and as a diuretic, in undue somnolence, in nervous headache, in narcotism. Also, at times when the exigencies of life require excessively prolonged wakefulness, caffeine may be used as the most powerful agent known for producing wakefulness. In a series of experiments, J. Hughes Bennett found that within narrow limits there is a direct physiological antagonism between caffeine and morphine. Coffee and caffeine in narcotic poisoning are of value as a means of keeping the patient awake and of stimulating the respiratory centers. As a cardiac stimulant, caffeine may be used in any form of heart failure. The indications for its use are those which call for the employment of digitalis. It is superior to digitalis in never disagreeing with the stomach, in having no distinctive cumulative tendency, and in the promptness of its action. It is pronouncedly inferior to digitalis in the power and certainty of its action, and in the permanence of its influence once asserted. As a diuretic, it is superior. It is very valuable in the treatment of cardiac dropsies, and is often useful in chronic Bright's disease, when there is no irritation of the kidneys. On account of its tendency to produce wakefulness, it is usually better to mass the doses early in the day, at least 6 hours being left between the last dose and the ordinary time for sleep. From 8 to 15 grams of caffeine may be given in the course of a day in severe cases. If tried, it would probably prove a useful drug in cases of sudden collapse from various causes. Good effects of coffee are recounted by Thomson. It removes the sensation of fatigue in the muscles and increases their functional activity. It allays hunger to a limited extent. It strengthens the heart action. It acts as a diuretic and increases the excretion of urea. It has a mildly sudorific influence. It counteracts nervous exhaustion and stimulates nerve centers. It is used sometimes as a nervine in cases of migraine, and there are many persons who can sustain prolonged mental fatigue and strain from anxiety and worry much better by the use of strong black coffee. In low delirium, or when the nervous system is overcome by the use of narcotics, or by excessive hemorrhage, strong black coffee is serviceable to keep the patient from falling into the drowsiness, which soon merges into coma. In such cases, as much as half a pint of strong black coffee may be injected into the rectum. Strong coffee with a little lemon juice or brandy is often useful in overcoming a malarial chill or a paroxysm of asthma. It is a useful temporary cardiac stimulant for children suffering collapse. Dr. Restrepo of Medellin, Colombia, claims to have cured many cases of chronic malaria and related diseases with infusion of green coffee after quinine has failed. Wallace states that tincture of green coffee is a natural and efficacious specific for cholera, and that she knows of more than 1,000 cases of cholera and diarrhea which have been treated with it without an isolated case of failure. Landana Bileo has been quoted as using raw coffee infusion in hepatic and nephritic diseases, venal and hepatic colics, and in diabetes. In the Civil War, surgeons utilized coffee in allaying malarial fever and other maladies with which they had to contend, often under the most trying conditions, and with severely limited means of combating disease. Its effect is to counteract the depressant action of low and miasmatic atmospheres, opening the secretions which they have checked. Travelers from the colder climes soon find that the fragrant cup of coffee is a corrective to derangements of the liver resulting from climatic conditions. Dr. Guillas of the French Navy, in a paper on typhoid fever, says, "Coffee has given us unhoped for satisfaction, and after having dispensed it we find, to our great surprise, that its action is as prompt as it is decisive. No sooner have our patients taken a few tablespoonfuls of it than their features become relaxed and they come to their senses. The next day the improvement is such that we are tempted to look upon coffee as a specific against typhoid fever. Under its influence the stupor is dispelled, and the patient arouses from the state of somnolency in which he has been since the invasion of the disease. Soon all the functions take their natural course, and he enters upon convalescence. Also, it has been reported that in extreme cases of yellow fever, coffee has been used most effectively by many physicians as the main reliance after all other well-known remedies have been administered and failed." According to Laurent, the use of coffee in gout is strictly prohibited by Humbert and Chittenham, but he considered it a mistake absolutely to forbid coffee, as, when a person has good kidneys, the small amount of uric acid furnished by the caffeine can readily be eliminated. A curious remedy for gout and rheumatism, the efficacy of which the writer scouts, is said to be a pint of hot, strong black coffee, which must be perfectly pure, and seasoned with a teaspoonful of pure black pepper, thoroughly mixed before drinking, and the preparation taken just before going to bed. If this has any value, it is probably purely psychological in its function. Several writers attribute amblyopia and other affections of the sight to coffee and chicory, without giving much conclusive experimental data. Beer, a Vienna oculist, however, held that the vapor from pure, hot, freshly made coffee is beneficial to the eyes. Coffee and caffeine are physiologically antagonistic to the common narcotics, nicotine, morphine, opium, alcohol, etc., and are frequently used as antidotes for these poisons. Binns found that dogs that have been stupefied with alcohol could be awakened with coffee. It may thus be prescribed for hard drinkers to counteract the baleful excitability produced by alcohol. In fact, many topers taper off after a long debauch with coffee containing small amounts of alcoholic beverages. Considering its ability to counteract the slow intoxication of tobacco, it may be inferred that coffee is indispensable for hard smokers. In general, the medicinal value of coffee may be said to be directly attributable to its caffeine content, although its antiseptic properties are dependent upon the volatile aromatic constituents. Its function is to raise and to sustain vitalities which have been lowered by disease or drugs. Although some of the cures attributed to it are probably purely traditional, still it must be admitted that by utilizing its stimulating qualities in many illnesses, the patient may be carried past the danger point into convalescence. Physiological action of cafetanic acid. It has been demonstrated in Chapter 17 that there is no definite compound, cafetanic acid, and that the heterogeneous material designated by this name does not possess the properties of tanning. Further substantiation of this contention, and more evidence of the innocuous character of the tannin-like compounds in coffee, are contained in the testimony of Salmon. Tannins precipitate proteins, gelatin, and connective tissue, and thus act as astringents, styptics, and antiseptics. The different tannins are not equivalent in these respects. Some, which are perhaps misnamed, such as those of coffee and ipecac, are practically non-precipitate. On the whole, one may say that small quantities of tannin ordinarily taken with the food and drink are not injurious, but that large quantities, excessive tea drinking, are certainly deleterious. The tannin of coffee is scarcely astringent, and therefore lacks this action, which is proven by the fact that it does not precipitate proteins. It has been claimed that cafetanic acid injures the stomach walls, but there is no evidence that this is so. Wiley, in reporting some of his experiments, says, Apparently, the efforts to settle the injurious effects of coffee drinking upon cafetanic acid, in any form in which it may exist in the coffee extract, are not supported by these recent data. The fact that tannins retard intestinal peristalsis, whereas coffee promotes this digestive action, lends further proof to the non-existence of tannin in coffee. These statements by eminent authorities may be consolidated into the verity that there is no tannin, in the true sense of the term, in coffee, and that the constituents of the coffee brew, which have been so designated, are physiologically harmless. Physiological action of caffeol. The evidence regarding the physiological action of caffeol is contradictory in many cases. J. Lehman found in 1853 that the empyreumatic oil of coffee, caffeone, is active, but more recent investigations have yielded results at variance with this. Hare and Marshall believed that they proved it to be active. E.T. Reichert, however, found it inactive in dogs, excepting insofar that, when given intravenously, it mechanically interfered with the circulation. With it, Binns was able to produce in man only feeble nervous excitement, with restlessness and increase in the rate and depth of respirations. The general effects, as summated by Salmon, are, for small doses, pleasant stimulation, increased respiration, increased heart rate, but fall of blood pressure, muscular restlessness, insomnia, perspiration, congestion. For large doses, increased peristalsis and defecation, depression of respiration and heart, fall of blood pressure and temperature, paralytic phenomena. It is doubtful whether the quantities taken in the beverage cause any direct central stimulation. Investigations have also been conducted with the various known constituents of this coffee oil. Erdmann found that in doses of between 0.5 and 0.6 gram per kilo of body weight, furan alcohol kills a rabbit by respiratory paralysis, and that the symptoms of poisoning are a short primary excitement, salivation, diarrhea, respiratory depression, continuous fall of the body temperature, and death from collapse with respiratory failure. In man, doses of from 0.6 to 1 gram of furan alcohol increased respiratory activity without producing other symptoms. However, man is not as susceptible to these compounds as are the smaller animals. But even if the relative susceptibility be assumed to be the same, the lethal dose given the rabbit is equivalent to giving a 140-pound man one dose containing the furan alcohol content of over 5,000 cups of coffee. Thus, in view of the very apparent minuteness of the quantity of this compound present in 1 cup of coffee, together with the fact that it is not cumulative in its physiological action, the importance of its toxic properties becomes very inconsequential to even the most profuse and inveterate coffee drinkers. Berman reported the volatile principle to have a reducing action on the hemoglobin, a depressing effect on the blood pressure, a depressant action on the central nervous system, disturbing the cardiac rhythm, and an action on the respiratory centers, causing dyspnea. The report of Serre regarding the minimum lethal dose of the concentrated combined active principles of coffee obtained from dry distillation is, for frogs, administered intraperitoneally and subcutaneously, 0.03 cubic centimeters per gram of body weight. For guinea pigs per stomach, 7.0 cubic centimeters per kilogram of body weight, and administered intravenously and intraperitoneally about 1.0 cubic centimeters per kilogram. This evidence regarding the physiological action of caffeol can not in any wise be construed to indicate a harmfulness of coffee. The percentage of these volatile substances in a cup of coffee infusion is so low as to be relatively negligible in its action. And, again, the caffeine content of the brew, as will be seen, tends to counteract any possible desultory effects of the caffeol. General physiological action of caffeine. More attention has been given to the study of the physiological action of caffeine than to that of the other individual constituents of coffee. Since certain of the effects of coffee drinking have been attributed to this alkaloid, a brief presentment of the pharmacology of caffeine will be given as an exposition of the many statements made regarding it. According to the British Pharmaceutical Codex, caffeine exerts 3 important actions: 1. On the central nervous system, 2. on muscles, including cardiac, and 3 on the kidney. The action on the central nervous system is mainly on that part of the brain connected with psychical functions. It produces a condition of wakefulness and increased mental activity. The interpretation of sensory impressions is more perfect and correct, and thought becomes clearer and quicker. With larger doses of caffeine, the action extends from the psychical areas to the motor area and to the cord, and the patient becomes at first restless and noisy, and later may show convulsive movements. Caffeine facilitates the performance of all forms of physical work, and actually increases the total work which can be obtained from muscle. On the normal man, however, it is impossible to say how much of the action on the muscle is central and how much peripheral, but, as fatigue shows itself first by an action on the center, it is probable that the action of caffeine in diminishing fatigue is mainly central. Caffeine accelerates the pulse and slightly raises blood pressure. It has no action in any way resembling digitalis. By increasing the irritability of the cardiac muscle, its prolonged use rather tends to fatigue than to rest the heart. Caffeine and its allies form a very important group of diuretics. The urine is generally of a lower specific gravity than normal, since it contains a lesser proportion of salt and urea, but the total excretion of solids, both as regards urea, uric acid, and salts, is increased. Caffeine, by exciting the medulla, produces an initial vasoconstriction of the kidneys, which tends at first to retard the flow of urine. So in recent years, other drugs have been introduced, allies of caffeine, which act like it on the kidneys, but are without the stimulant action on the brain. Theobromine is such a drug. Another authority states that one of the most constant symptoms produced in man by overdoses of caffeine is excessive diuresis, and experiments made upon the lower animals show that caffeine acts as a diuretic, not only by influencing the circulation, but also by directly affecting the secreting cells, the probabilities being in favor of the first of these theories of action. According to Schroeder, not only the water but also the solids of the urine are increased. The question whether caffeine has an influence upon tissue changes and the consequent nitrogenous elimination cannot be considered as distinctly answered, though the most probable conclusion is that the action of caffeine upon urea elimination and upon general nutrition is not direct or pronounced. While the therapeutic dose of caffeine is broken up in the body with the formation of methylxanthine, which escapes with the urine, the toxic dose is at least in part eliminated by the kidney unchanged. The metabolism of methylpurines, of which group caffeine is a member, appears to vary with the quantity ingested. The manner in which the methyl group is liberated by the cell protoplasm is said to determine the amount of stimulus which the tissues receive from these substances. The xanthine group is almost without any excitatory action, and its metabolic end products are constant. Perhaps the variation in the excretions of unchanged methylpurines is dependent upon the amount of total reactive energy they invoke. Baldi found that caffeine in small doses increases muscular excitability in dogs and frogs. The spinal and muscular hyperic excitability produced by caffeine is, in his opinion, due to the methyl groups attached to the xanthine nucleus. Frederick states that caffeine increases the irritability of the cardiac vagus and accelerates the appearance of pseudofatigue of the vagus, which is produced by prolonged stimulation of the nerve. The action of caffeine on the mammalian heart has also been investigated by Pilker, who found that, following the rapid intravenous injection of caffeine, there is an acute fall of blood pressure, and with a maximal quantity of caffeine, 10 milligrams per kilogram, the cardiac volume and the amplitude of the excursions are usually unchanged. With larger quantities, the volume progressively increases and the amplitude of the excursion decreases. Salant found that the intravenous injection of 15 to 25 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram in animals was followed by a fall of blood pressure amounting to 7 to 35% in most cases, which was transitory, although in some animals it remained unchanged. A moderate rise was rarely observed. Caffeine aids the action of nitrates, acetanilide, ethyl alcohol, and amyl alcohol, and increases the toxicity of barium chloride. In a very thorough study of the toxicity of caffeine, which he made with Riger, a greater toxicity of about 15 to 20% by subcutaneous injection than by mouth, and but about 1/2 of this when injected peritoneally, was found. Intramuscularly, the toxicity is 30% greater than subcutaneously. In making the tests on animals, they found that individuality, season, age, species, and certain pathological conditions caused variation in the toxic effect of the administered caffeine. Low-protein diet tends to decrease resistance to caffeine in dogs, and a milk or meat diet does the same for growing dogs. Caffeine is not cumulative for the rabbit or dog. As a result of experiments on the action of caffeine on the bronchospasm caused by peptone, wit, sucpeptone, B-imidazolylethylamine, curare, vasodilation, and mucarine, Pell concluded that caffeine stimulates certain branches of the peripheral sympathetic and is thus enabled to widen the bronchi or remove bronchospasm. According to Lapique, caffeine produces a change in the excitability of the medulla of the frog similar to that produced by raising the temperature of the nerve centers. Scherhoff has pointed out that the continued use of large quantities of caffeine will produce cardiac irregularity and sleeplessness. Cochrane cited 3 cases where caffeine was hypodermically administered in cases of acute indigestion, etc., and concluded that the cases prove that caffeine, or a compound containing it as a synergist, does indirectly make the injection of morphia a safe proceeding, and directly increases the force of the heart and arterial tension. However, Wood found that medium doses of caffeine do not produce any marked rise in blood pressure and cause a reduction in pulse rate. He attributes the contradictory results which prior investigations gave to employment of unusually large doses and to inaccurate experimental methods. Caffeine was found by Nonnenbruch and Saziska to have a slight action toward accelerating the coagulation time of the blood, being active over several hours. It inhibits coagulation in vitro. Its action in the body apparently rests on an increase of the fibrin ferment. There is no reason to believe that the behavior is dependent on a toxic action, but there is probably an action on the spleen, for in several rabbits from which the spleen was removed, no action was observed. Experiments conducted by Leventhal gave no positive information as to the formation of uric acid from caffeine in the human organism. The elimination of caffeine has also been studied by Salant and Riger, who found that larger amounts of caffeine are demethylated in carnivora than in herbivora, and resistance to caffeine is inversely as demethylation, caffeine being much more toxic in the former class. In a similar investigation, Zenitz observed that caffeine is very slightly eliminated from the system by the kidneys, and that its action on the heart is cumulative. Therefore, he concludes that it is contraindicated in all renal diseases, in arteriosclerosis, and in cardiac affections secondary to them. The inaccuracy of these conclusions regarding the non-elimination of caffeine and those of Albanese, Bonzinski and Gottlieb, Levin, Schutzque, and Minkowski has been shown by Mendel and Wardell, who point out that many of these experimenters worked with dogs in which the chief end product of purine metabolism is not uric acid, but allantoin. They observe that the increase in excretion of uric acid after the addition of caffeine to the diet seems to be proportional to the quantity of caffeine taken, and equivalent to from 10 to 15% of the ingested caffeine. The remainder of the caffeine is probably eliminated as monomethylpurines. Regarding the alleged cumulative action of caffeine, Pletzer, Liebreich, Zikacs, Pawinski, and Seifert all concluded from their investigations that the action of caffeine is usually of brief duration and does not have a cumulative effect because of its rapid elimination, so that there is no danger of intoxication. Dr. Oswald Schmiedberg says, caffeine is a means of refreshing bodily and mental activity, so that this may be prolonged when the condition of fatigue has already begun to produce restraint, and to call for more severe exertion of the will, a state which, as is well known, is painful or disagreeable. This advantageous effect, in conditions of fatigue, of small quantities of caffeine, as it is commonly taken in coffee or tea, might, however, by continued use become injurious, if it were in all cases necessarily exerted. That is to say, if by caffeine the muscles and nerves were directly spurred on to increased activity. This is not the case, however, and just in this lies the peculiarity of the effect in question. The muscles and the simultaneously acting nerves only under the influence of caffeine respond more easily to the impulse of the will, but do not develop spontaneous activity, that is, without the cooperation of the will. The character of caffeine action makes plain that these food materials do not injure the organism by their caffeine content, and do not by continued use cause any chronic form of illness. According to Dr. Hollingworth's deductions, caffeine is the only known stimulant that quickens the functions of the human body without a subsequent period of depression. His explanation for this behavior is that caffeine acts as a lubricator for the nervous system, having an actual physical action whereby the nerves are enabled to do their work more easily. Other stimulants act on the nerves themselves, causing a waste of energy, and consequently, according to nature's law, a period of depression follows, and the whole process tends to injure the human machine. In not a single instance during his experiments at Columbia University did depression follow the use of caffeine. Of course, caffeine, like any other alkaloid, if used to excess, will prove harmful, due to the overstimulation induced by it. However, taken in moderate quantities, as in coffee and tea by normal persons, the conclusions of Hirsch may be taken as correct. Namely, caffeine is a mild stimulant, without direct effect on the muscles, the effect resulting from its own destruction and being temporary and transitory. It is not a depressant, either initially or eventually, and is not habit-forming, but a true stimulant, as distinguished from sedatives and habit-forming drugs. Caffeine and mental and motor efficiency. The literature on the influence of caffeine on fatigue has been summarized, and the older experiments clearly pointed out by Rivers. A summary of the most important researches which have had as their object the determination of the influence of caffeine on mental and motor processes has been made by Hollingworth, from whose monograph much of the following material has been taken. Increase in the force of muscular contractions was demonstrated in 1892 by De Sarlo and Bernardini for caffeine and by Kraepelin for tea. These investigators used the dynamometer as a measure of the force of contraction. However, most of the subsequent work on motor processes has been by the ergographic method. Ugolino Mosso, Koch, Rossi, Sobieranski, Hoch and Kraepelin, Destree, Benedicenti, Schumberg, Hellstein, and Joltico have all observed a stimulating effect of caffeine on ergographic performance. Only one investigation of those reported by Rivers failed to find an appreciable effect, that of Oreskowski and Kraepelin, while Ferret affirms that the effect is only an acceleration of fatigue. In spite of the general agreement as to the presence of stimulation, there is some dissension regarding whether only the height of the contractions or their number or both are affected. As might be expected from the great diversity of methods employed, the quantitative results also have varied considerably. Carefully controlled experiments by Rivers and Weber confirm in general the conclusion reached by all previous workers that caffeine stimulates the capacity for muscular work, and it is clear that this increase is not due to the various psychical factors of interest, sensory stimulation, and suggestion which the experiments were especially designed to exclude. The greatest increase falls, however, far short of that described by some previous workers, such as Mosso, and it is probable that part of the effect described by these workers was due to the factors in question. Investigations of mental processes under the influence of caffeine have been much less frequent, most notable among which are those of Dietl and Winschgau, Dehio, Kraepelin and Hoch, Ack, Langfeld and Rivers. Kraepelin observes, "We know that tea and coffee increase our mental efficiency in a definite way, and we use these as a means of overcoming mental fatigue. In the morning these drinks remove the last traces of sleepiness, and in the evening, when we still have intellectual tasks to dispose of, they aid in keeping us awake. Their use induces a greater briskness and clearness of thought, after which secondary fatigue is either entirely absent or is very slight." Tendency toward habituation of the psychic functions to caffeine has been studied by Wedemeyer, who found that in the regular administration of it in the course of 4 to 5 weeks, there is a measurable weakening of its action on psychic processes. Rivers, who seems to have been the first to appreciate fully the genuine and practical importance of thoroughly controlling the psychological factors that are likely to play a role in such experiments, concludes that caffeine increases the capacity for both muscular and mental work, this stimulating action persisting for a considerable time after the substance has been taken without there being any evidence, with moderate doses, of reaction leading to diminished capacity for work, the substance thus really diminishing and not merely obscuring the effects of fatigue. Subsequent to these investigations was that of Hollingworth, which is at once the most comprehensive, carefully conducted, and scientifically accurate one yet performed. He employed an ample number of subjects in his experimentation, and both his subjects and the assistants who recorded the observations were in no wise cognizant of the character or quantity of the dose of caffeine administered, the other experimental conditions being similarly rigorous and extensive. The purpose of his study was to determine both qualitatively and quantitatively the effect of caffeine on a wide range of mental and motor processes by studying the performance of a considerable number of individuals for a long period of time under controlled conditions. To study the way in which this influence is modified by such factors as the age, sex, weight, idiosyncrasy, and previous caffeine habits of the subjects, and the degree to which it depends on the amount of the dose and the time and conditions of its administration, and to investigate the influence of caffeine on the general health, quality and amount of sleep, and food habits of the individual tested. To obtain this information, the chief tests employed were the steadiness, tapping, coordination, typewriting, color naming, calculations, opposites, cancellation, and discrimination tests, the familiar size-weight illusion, quality and amount of sleep, and general health and feeling of well-being. A brief review of the results of these tests is given in the tabular summary. From these, Hollingworth concluded that caffeine influenced all the tests in a given group in much the same way. The effect on motor processes comes quickly and is transient, while the effect on higher mental processes comes more slowly and is more persistent. Whether this result is due to quicker reaction on the part of motor nerve centers, or whether it is due to a direct peripheral effect on the muscle tissue, is uncertain. But the indications are that caffeine has a direct action on the muscle tissue, and that this effect is fairly rapid in appearance. The two principal factors which seem to modify the degree of caffeine influence are body weight and presence of food in the stomach at the time of ingestion of the caffeine. In practically all of the tests, the magnitude of the caffeine influence varied inversely with the body weight, and was most marked when taken on an empty stomach or without food substance. This variance in action was also true for both the quality and amount of sleep, and seemed to be accentuated when taken on successive days, but it did not appear to depend on the age, sex, or previous caffeine habits of the individual. Those who had given up the use of caffeine-containing beverages during the experiment did not report any craving for the drinks as such, but several expressed a feeling of annoyance at not having some sort of a warm drink for breakfast. It is interesting to note that he also found a complete absence of any trace of secondary depression or of any sort of secondary reaction consequent upon the stimulation which was so strikingly present in many of the tests. The production of an increased capacity for work was clearly demonstrated, the same being a genuine drug effect, and not merely the effect of excitement, interest, sensory stimulation, expectation, or suggestion. However, this study does not show whether this increased capacity comes from a new supply of energy introduced or rendered available by the drug action, or whether energy already available comes to be employed more effectively, or whether fatigue sensations are weakened and the individual's standard of performance thereby raised. But they do show that from a standpoint of mental and productive physical efficiency, the widespread consumption of caffeinic beverages, even under circumstances in which and by individuals for whom the use of other drugs is stringently prohibited or decried, is justified. Conclusion. Brief summarization of the information available on the pharmacology of coffee indicates that it should be used in moderation, particularly by children, the permissible quantity varying with the individual and ascertainable only through personal observation. Used in moderation, it will prove a valuable stimulant increasing personal efficiency in mental and physical labor. Its action in the alimentary regime is that of an adjuvant food, aiding digestion, favoring increased flow of the digestive juices, promoting intestinal peristalsis, and not tanning any portion of the digestive organs. It reacts on the kidneys as a diuretic and increases the excretion of uric acid, which, however, is not to be taken as evidence that it is harmful in gout. Coffee has been indicated as a specific for various diseases, its functions therein being the raising and sustaining of low vitalities. Its effect on longevity is virtually nil. A small proportion of humans who are very nervous may find coffee undesirable, but sensible consumption of coffee by the average, normal, non-neurasthenic person will not prove harmful but beneficial. End of section 24.